The world champion is back in action over the board in Norway Chess 2020, held in Stavanger in Norway. And I want to catch up with him and his round 2 game against Alireza Firouzja, who had a good round 1. He defeated Duda. This is a fascinating struggle, incredibly tense. So let's take a look. The world champion against Firouzja, the Iranian prodigy, now living in France, of course. So Carlsen with the white pieces. And it's a very orthodox start to the game, a Queen's Gambit. And Carlsen really likes fixed pawn structures, and he goes for one straight away by playing this so-called exchange variation. And it's all orthodox so far. H6 is the modern take on this position for black. Castles and knight ge2, rook e8, castles kingside, knight d7, and now f3. And this is the way that Botvinnik liked to play this system. So instead of going for the minority attack, the basic idea for white is to try to push through the middle of the board. But of course, it's all in the timing, and that centre can be a little bit unstable. And here the normal moves are knight f8 for black, or perhaps c5. But Firouzja played an extraordinary move, b5. It looks so anti-positional because that pawn on c6 is now backward. There could be pressure along the c-file. Sometimes the c5 square is weak. As Vladimir Kramnik commented in his live commentary, said if he'd suggested this move in the Botvinnik school of chess, he'd have probably been thrown out. There is actually method in this madness. As we're going to see, it actually gains space, and black can use that space on the queen side, and it also distracts white from this central push as well. Of course, we have to bear in mind that this move is actually suggested by many of the strong engines in this position as well. So it's interesting to see how, some players, younger players, just pay no heed to chess history, but focus on what the computer is suggesting as well. Or at least, they have greater reliance on chess computers than chess history, let's put it like that. And there have been a few games with this played recently. So here we can see a couple of other strong players have experimented with b5. Knight b6 was played by Ulyanov. I don't like knight b6 because after b3, then that knight on b6 has nowhere to go. a6 is decent. That was played German Bundesliga, and that simply supports this pawn, and black can push with c5. But Firouzja plays here bishop b7. It looks like an odd square for the bishop, but if black is going to push with c5, then it does support the pawn on d5. So knight g3, b4, this is the point, pushes the knight to the side of the board, and then c5. So this makes it very difficult for white to obviously push forward in the middle with e4. And knight f5 from Carlsen, so that knight comes to this superb square on f5. Here is a really important moment in the game where black has a big decision. So what do you do with the pawn structure? You can see there are threats here, potentially threats here as well. There's pressure on c5. Black has to decide, what do you do with that pawn on c5? Do you exchange on d4? Do you push, or do you simply leave it there? Well, after about a 20-minute think, Firouzja decided just to drop the bishop back. He could have pushed with c4. This is so often a really difficult decision to make in the Queen's Gambit. Allowed that bishop to be taken. Of course, black has these wonderful pawns here, but pressure has been taken off that white pawn on d4, which can make it easier to push with e4. That's potentially a problem. But I mean, this is really double-edged. I think Carlsen would probably be not unhappy with that. But I think, that's quite a critical test of white strategy. Taking is definitely not a good idea, because this kind of position leaves white with two beautiful bishops. And this bishop on b7 is dreadful. So it's really c4 here, or dropping the bishop back. And Firouzja decided after a very long think, about 20-minute thinks, to drop that bishop to f8. So that gave Carlsen the opportunity to exchange on c5. And now we have an isolated queen pawn position. And that knight is very well placed on f5. So rook c1 and now queen b6. But you can see the point of Firouzja's expansion with the b pawn, that it does give black the opportunity to build up pressure here. And queen on b6 connects the rooks. We like that. So black just has more space after that b5 pawn push. Queen a4, but I mean, white's position is pretty good here. That knight solidly protects e3 and controls a lot of very important squares. Bishop c8, excellent move. So that knight is forced back. The bishop wasn't doing anything on b7 anyway. Knight d4, bishop d7, queen a6. Rook e7, rook fd1. So Carlsen has a pretty nice position in the centre. And the question is, how should black play this position? I think it's very, very difficult for black to find a meaningful plan here. But I really like Firouzja's next move. And it takes a lot of guts to play like this. Basically, black's pieces are pretty well placed, apart from that knight on f6, which, because of the pawn on f3, means it has no chance to move to a decent square. So Firouzja plays knight e8. This is an excellent move. Basically, that knight is going to reroute via c7, possibly sometimes even d6, but, well, in this case, it should be c7, and then it's going to move to e6 to challenge the knight on d4. So let's see how this works in practice. It's quite tricky because, I mean, once the knight is in the new location, then it's fine. But it takes a long time to travel there. This is the problem. In the meantime, white can do a few things. Now that exchange opens up the A file. Now these pawns aren't beautiful, but they are protected by that bishop at the moment. Bishop b1 protects the pawn on a2. Bishop a4, that's a nice provocative move. So really pushes white into b3. The bishop drops back, and later on, as we'll see, in fact, black is able to use that square. Knight e2, here's a very interesting moment. So Carlsen is hoping that black is going to take there. Let's just have a quick look at that. After this, in fact, that exchange would be highly beneficial for white, because after rook d4, you can see with that bishop gone, the rook is going to come in, take that pawn, and then these two pawns really look vulnerable. Black's pieces are very poorly placed. So in this position, after knight e2, instead of taking that pawn on e3, knight c7, Firouzja continues with his knight maneuver. And now, well, I think Carlsen would have liked to have played e4 in this position to exchange off those bishops, but it's just not working. because after e4, you can see that here, that pawn can be taken, and basically black is fine there. So that's why Carlsen played rook d2, just marking time for the moment, protecting this here. Then bishop c6, and you can see, well, e4 just isn't going to happen now. Knight d4, and the bishop went back to b7, but at least from here, yeah, it's gone back to this square behind the pawn, but it is preventing white from breaking with e4 at some moment here. So what does Carlsen do next? Well, he does have a nice blockading knight on d4. He has a solid position. But clearly it's not going to be possible to put any more pressure on d5. Can't do anything on the c file for the moment. That bishop is solidly protected. Well, really, there's only one sector where he can make some progress, and that is the king side, g4. So he starts to expand with his pawns there, and positionally that's quite nice. I mean, it's not absolutely clear what's going to happen, but this is a very typical plan to expand with the pawns. Knight e6. So finally that knight has found its way to this very fine square e6, where it puts some pressure on d4. And this was the whole point of this maneuver from f6. Excellent stuff from Firouzja. Knight f5, hitting the rook. Now I think the rook should, the rook should connect with rook e8. And I think black is basically fine there. Cheers, folks. Let me just have another quick swig of tea. But rook c7 played. Now let's see. Carlsen continues his expansion. Rook d1. And actually things are turning in Carlsen's favour. Bishop g3 attacks the rook on c7, which came to c3. I mean, that was the point of, you remember, provoking the pawn move b3, king f2, but actually things are turning in white's favour. Looks as though Firouzja with black is actually doing pretty well here, but here Carlsen missed a strong move. He could have played bishop d6. Instead he played bishop d3, but what's the point of bishop d6? In fact, whoops, let's play bishop d6 and see the point of this. In fact, it's very hard for black to avoid a nasty knight fork here. So if that bishop is taken, then you can see the knight forks rook and bishop, and the d pawn is going to drop. If rook e8, again, that's exchange followed by knight d6, and the d pawn is going to drop. Or rook a8. Knight e7 check, and after an exchange here, again the d pawn drops. Basically bishop d6 actually just is incredibly strong. It's very hard for black after that move, but instead Carlsen played here bishop d3, which I understand. That bishop was doing nothing on b1. He's looking to reroute it perhaps here. But d4 is a good move from Firouzja. Exchanging will obviously bring nothing for white, so therefore e4. Wow, what a solid rook that is on c3. You know, you might be able to simply offer an exchange sacrifice to get those pawns rolling. Rook a8. The rook returns to the a file. Good move. There's pressure there. And basically, in fact, it's not just pressure on the a file. Firouzja wants to play bishop, miscue with the arrow, bishop a6 to exchange off that blockader. And black is doing pretty well here. Carlsen played bishop c4. Clearly his idea is to meet bishop a6 with bishop d5. Now, that's also a way for black to play. You could do that. But Firouzja with, well, I think at this point he had something like 5 minutes on the clock. Roughly that time. And Carlsen had something like 20 minutes. And Firouzja played rook c2. Now that is a great move. Really interesting. And at this point, well, Carlsen invested something like, well, over 10 minutes on his next move. This is a real shocker. Carlsen clearly either forgot about this move or underestimated it. Well, tactically, let's see what the problem is. So if rook takes, then d3 check, discovered attack. And then pawn takes and rook takes a2. Well, white might be able to scramble equality here, but nothing more. Or, well, I mean, there are various options here, but bishop e5 is similar to the game. Basically, Carlsen realized he'd gone wrong and he has to compromise and scramble for a draw because a2 is now hanging. So he played bishop d3. So he didn't want any more tricks with that discovered check here. So Firouzja took on a2. He's won a pawn. But because Carlsen still has a solid position and these pawns are blockaded, then, well, it's not much of an extra pawn. And in fact, after this, rook takes, rook a5. That's an interesting move. So he wants to play bishop a6 and didn't want to have that pin on the a file. In fact, things simplify pretty quickly. Bishop a6. And now Carlsen had to liquidate the position because obviously black can start to go on the offensive. So Carlsen took the d pawn and now we have a big exchange. So rook a3, rook d3, that holds things. I mean, that bishop can move away and then, you know, white is fine. So therefore, knight takes. And the game fizzled out to a draw after these moves. Let me just go through to the end of the game. There was really nothing that black can do here. With the king so far away, unable to support any passed pawn, then clearly it's going to be a draw. After that, they went into an Armageddon game that somehow Carlsen managed to win, although Firouzja was doing really, really well. But, well, Carlsen showed his prowess at speed chess in that Armageddon game. But I thought that was a fascinating struggle. I think strategically, both players showed great skill, and I really like Firouzja's manoeuvres, and he caught out Carlsen with this move rook c2. There are other moves there, but rook c2 is, you know, was a bit of a shocker for Carlsen, but he did have enough time to gather his thoughts and somehow regain his equilibrium. So there we go. It's a very exciting tournament, and frankly, I'm delighted to be covering some over-the-board chess again. So more reports coming your way soon. Thanks for watching.